Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be wrapping up the Harlequin series by looking at mono Harlequin lists in 10th edition and talking about how to play them. So what I've learned over the last couple weeks playing a mono Harlequin list is that even though a lot of people think Harlequins are dead as a solo army, they actually have some pretty good matchups and can be very strong when played correctly. But just to address the elephant in the room, they are nowhere as strong as they were last edition. And I think that's pretty undisputed. No one would really argue with that. They did lose a lot of power in what they could do, and they lost a lot of the dynamicness that made them so good last edition. Despite that, though, my experience over the last couple weeks has shown me that they actually have some really good matchups against most of the mid-tier armies. And while they're not really going to compete with things like Genestealer Cult, Wraith Knight Eldari lists, or, the other top-tier factions like Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights, they can do really well against other armies in the game. And most importantly, Harlequins are still really fun and interesting to play. Veteran Harlequin players probably will look at this build and think, well, I lost a lot of what made it fun for me. And that's fair, right? That's a fair assessment. But for those of you who do like Harlequins, they still are enjoyable and they still kept a lot of the same aspects and feel that they had last edition. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into the video and talk about playing a Harlequin list in 10th edition. Okay, so first a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at in today's video. We're going to be doing a general analysis of Harlequins in 10th edition. We're going to be talking about the strengths and weaknesses of pure Harlequin armies, general tips and strategies when fielding and playing a Harlequin army, and an example of a pure Harlequin list of my own that I've been running in 10th edition over the last couple of weeks. So when talking about Harlequins in 10th edition, I think we do have to mention that, like I said in the beginning of the video, they have had a lot of their special rules cut from 9th edition. Things like moving through enemy units and army-wide advance and charge are but a few things that they lost, which were really important to determining their trickiness and playstyle. And as a result of those losses, they did lose a lot of flavor in what they can do, especially in combination with the nerf to close combat. So as many of you guys know, close combat was nerfed. You can't move as far in close combat anymore. Consolidation is a little bit hampered and things like that. So Harlequins took the brunt end of this. They are primarily a combat army, and as such, they were negatively impacted by this change. However, most of the units in the Harlequin roster got a lot cheaper as a result and are much more expendable. Even though they can't do as much, they're much less expensive than before. And many of us will remember paying 110 points for a unit of 5 Harlequins, and now we only have to pay 75 points, and we can still get most of the weapon upgrades on there like before, even though some of them are less powerful. So, in general, Harlequins are largely considered effective individually when integrated within craft world builds, but as a whole army, the community figures they're pretty much dead on arrival when run in competitive play. And yes, in the current meta, I don't think competitively, if you want to get a top spot in a tournament, they're going to be able to compete with certain armies, right? They're not going to be able to compete with an Imperial Knights army, or they're not going to be able to compete with a craft world Eldar build that's using a Wraith Knight or something like that. They will lose those games, but there are a lot of matchups that they can do very well in. So if you're afraid to run your Harlequins in a competitive tournament because you're worried you're going to get swept and get 0 for 3 or 0 for 6 or something like that, I wouldn't worry about that too much, right? Especially if you're a veteran Harlequin player, you can find ways to beat most of the factions of the game. The other thing you have to consider is that a lot of the factions right now in 40k are severely underpowered compared to the top factions. And Harlequins as a whole can still compete against those other factions quite well, even if they can't compete against the top factions in the game and the top builds in the game. All right, so having said that and kind of talked about what people generally think about Harlequins in 10th edition, let's talk about their strengths and weaknesses. So as for their strengths, they are effective at surviving against high AP attacks in low volumes. Because they all have a 4+ invul save, attacks from things like star cannons or plasma weapons are pretty ineffective against them, right? If an opponent is bringing a lot of plasma with them to deal with the meta, which is, high armor save, high toughness units, then Harlequins are going to be pretty apt to take that on the chin and not really worry too much about it. Plasma weapons and their equivalents are just really ineffective against Harlequins in general. They also have amazing anti-vehicle damage with their Haywire weapons, some of the best in the game. Haywires basically do mortal wounds to vehicles on a 4+. A unit of Skyweavers can basically, on average, net an average of 6 mortal wounds against an enemy vehicle. And that's every single time they shoot, pretty much. You're getting a reroll to hit and you're getting a reroll to wound. So most likely, you are going to be able to do that consistently. And for 95 points, that's extremely cost effective. Harlequins also have great lone operatives, some of the best in the game. The Death Jester with Fate's Messenger absolutely shreds both characters and infantry with devastating wounds and sustained hits. It's just an absolute blender against infantry and can even hit hard against tougher targets. In fact, I had a game with Chaos Knights where the Death Jester killed over 400 points worth of enemy Chaos Knights. He almost one-shotted a War Dog by himself. Yes, I rolled pretty lucky, and I got those 6s. I got that famous Yahtzee, but even so, he was punching way above his weight class. And the Solitaire is an excellent lone operative as well that basically can kill anything he hits. So he's a really good assassin. He can go in there and basically take out Abaddon if he's allowed to. So yes, they can overwatch him, but if you're able to bait out an overwatch on other units first, you can go in there basically scot-free and get a free kill on Abaddon himself. And essentially anything that's under toughness 6 is also fair game for the Solitaire. So if he's able to wound on 3s, the high volume amount of attacks that he has with a great chance to hit can spell doom for a lot of units. And on top of that, remember he is a lone operative, so using Phantasm on him to protect him from assaults or units getting within 12 inches to be able to shoot him is a very great tactic as well. And in general, Harlequins are very fast and hit reasonably hard for their points cost. Again, remember, you're paying less for each specific Harlequin unit, but you're getting more of them as a result throughout your whole army. So they're a little bit more expendable, and you can always use Harlequin troops together to gang up on particularly hard targets. Okay, but that's the strengths of the Harlequins. What are their weaknesses? Well, unfortunately, their damage against tough, non-vehicle targets is pretty abysmal. Because they don't have any great weapons against monsters, they often perform very poorly against them. So Haywire weapons may be great against vehicles, but against, tougher monsters, things from the Tyrannid army or, things from Chaos Demons, they can be kind of ineffective against them with a lot of their weapons. So that is something that they struggle with currently. They're also extremely vulnerable to high volume shooting, even more so than craft-rolled armies. And I know what some of you may be thinking, well, what do you mean? Well, in a lot of craft-rolled armies, you have units like Wraith Guard, Wraith Lords, Wraith Knights, tough units like that to, absorb that anti-infantry firepower. Or if you have a smaller unit of infantry, a lot of them do actually come with a 3+ armor save. And they will most likely be benefiting from cover. So they're getting +1 to their save against most weapons that maybe have a high volume of shooting. Harlequins don't get that benefit, right? So they're going to have a 4+ invul save no matter what. So even though they're really strong against, low volume, high AP shots, they're a lot worse against high volume, low AP shots. And having said that, Harlequins are also very weak against indirect fire and towering units. So if the enemy can ignore line of sight and basically shoot over you, they're going to do a lot of damage. Now, the only thing I will say is that if you have true line of sight blocking, you can hide a lot of Harlequin units behind ruins against towering units. And this is probably one of the few saving graces that you can benefit from. Because a lot of Harlequin units are very low profile and very kind of smaller, right? You're not talking about a huge fire prism. That's kind of hard to hide. You're talking about maybe a small Void Weaver or a small Sky Weaver or something like that, right? So they are easier to hide when you have true line of sight blocking terrain, but obscuring terrain isn't going to do anything for you. And because most of the boards have ruins with windows in them, it's going to be a little bit hard to hide those things. So turn 1, if the board doesn't have a lot of true line of sight blocking terrain and you're going up against Knights or Chaos Knights or what have you, a lot of things with towering, your units just aren't going to survive that well. And you're basically going to be starting the game at a disadvantage. And lastly, and probably the most importantly, probably what keeps them out of the running for the top tables in competitive play, is that their primary objective game is absolute trash. With the changes in the new addition to how objective control works, Harlequins are rarely able to control objectives. Harlequin troops have objective control 1 on their units, and basically every single unit they have is objective control 2 or less. Sometimes, at the very most, you get objective control 3. And that's really only the Skyweavers who have objective control apiece. So the jet bikes have objective control 2 each, so if you have a unit of 2, you're going to have OC 4. But the Star Weavers and the Void Weavers just have objective control 2, so they're not going to be able to control any objectives. Basically, the primary objective game for Harlequins is extremely difficult. So when playing Harlequins, you often don't want to rely on primary objectives to score the most points, which can be an issue against certain armies that are really good at scoring primaries. Okay, so having gone over their strengths and weaknesses, let's talk about some general tips and strategies when fielding and playing a Harlequin army. So first of all, it's really important that you don't commit a lot to the center of the board. With Harlequins, they're very fragile, so putting them in the center of the board or fighting over the center is a sure way to lose in the first couple of turns, especially if you're overly aggressive. So, during the first couple of turns in the game, you want to play the flanks, try to get around your opponent so that you can surround them, get in their deployment zone, mess with their supporting units in the back, and then bait your opponent to the center early with a unit that can escape easily. So I like doing this with a unit of Skyweavers, because usually they're just enough of a threat to where your opponent will have to allocate resources to deal with them, but they're not so expensive that losing them would lose you the game. So this kind of creates a tough situation for your opponent who is going to have to measure how many resources they actually want to allocate to dealing with the Skyweavers. And oftentimes your opponent will make a mistake and you'll be able to trade up from there. And also, this kind of plays into the idea that you have to be patient during the first few turns of the game and focus on picking off vulnerable targets without exposing yourself. And this means during the first couple turns of the game, you do really want to focus more on shooting than assault. And I know that seems a little bit weird because Harlequins are an assault army. They really do like to get stuck into combat. However, they do have some pretty versatile and substantial shooting, especially if you build them around Skyweavers, Star Weavers, and Void Weavers, right? And that's not even to mention the Death Jester, who's perhaps the most points efficient shooter in the entire index. So use your shooting, be patient, whittle down your opponent's forces so that later on in the game, your combat is going to be more effective. Because if you rush forward too quickly, your opponent's just going to pick your models up with Overwatch and just whittle you down after you win your first combats. Again, most of the units your opponent is going to use in the early game aren't going to be substantial enough for your Harlequin units to trade up against. Also, lastly, don't try to hold objectives early in the game. Let your opponent get to the objectives first so that you can have easier targets to kill, and wait until the later stages of the game when your opponent doesn't have as many units on the board to capture and hold those objectives. You also need to know as a Harlequins player what you can and can't kill in any given turn, because wasting shots on a target that's not going to end up dying is going to end up spelling doom for you. So if you can't kill it, it's best to ignore it. And in general, just play around it. So if your opponent has a nasty unit of Terminators or a big unit of something like a Death Star on the center of the battlefield, don't try to just charge a bunch of stuff into it because you're just going to be charging things into the meat grinder. Ignore it, play around it, and basically don't interact with it if you can't destroy it. And so unless you know the math behind your units and what you exactly need to kill that unit, if you have enough firepower on average to kill that unit, definitely go for it. But if you don't even try it. It's not worth it because you're going to end up losing a lot more than it took to kill in the first place. And lastly, but not least, do not throw away your solitaire in a trade. Use Phantasm, Lone Operative, and Obscuring Terrain to get value out of them throughout multiple turns. You don't want to just throw them into something even if you think you're trading up, right? Your solitaire is 115 points, and let's say you trade him into a 125 point unit, right? Yeah, that's fantastic. You did trade up, and no one's going to say you didn't do that. But the fact of the matter is, with proper planning and tactics and clever use of Phantasm and line-of-sight blocking terrain and things like that, you probably could have gotten a lot more value out of your solitaire over multiple turns. And to give you an example of this, I've had a lot of success using the solitaire on the flanks to support the rest of my units and thus help them get into my opponent's deployment zone to score on secondary objectives. And at that point in the game, the Solitaire is a great control piece to basically dictate your opponent's movement on the flanks. Your opponent is going to have a lot more trouble navigating to reclaim that lost ground if there's a Solitaire, ready to charge in at a moment's notice. So if you are running a pure Harlequins list, consider using the Solitaire for a little bit more than just a trading piece. Alright, so having gone over the general tips and strategies to using Harlequins in 10th edition, I wanted to show you guys an example of a pure Harlequin list that I've been running over the last couple of weeks and kind of analyze it together with you to show you what each unit does and how I tend to use them in my games. And hopefully give you guys a little bit of insight into, how the list works, how you can run a pure Harlequins army, but also just the interactiveness between the units and what they're supposed to be doing in games. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right into the list. So first, this was a 2,000 point list, and it is a Strike Force game. For my characters, I have a Death Jester, of course, with the Fate's Messenger enhancement. And we all know what this guy's good at. He's just basically good at killing stuff. He's there to remove characters from enemy units, but he also is pretty good at just dishing out heavy range damage with Sustained 3. The Death Jester that doesn't have any upgrades, you might be thinking is a little bit weird, right? Like, why take something if it doesn't have the Fate's Messenger? Or is able to use the Death Jester's special ability to do additional damage, either precision or Sustained 3. So while this Death Jester is not going to be doing much of any damage at all, he does have one very important task, and that is to sit on objectives. Yes, you heard that correctly. This Death Jester's only job is to sit on objectives in my own backfield and hold them and be immune to indirect fire. There's a lot of opponents out there who have heavy indirect fire elements, and this is really strong against Harlequins, and it's even kind of decent against Void Weavers, right? Void Weavers are something you would typically think could hold objectives in the back and be fairly durable against indirect fire. But they're really not. And the reason being is because their toughness is kind of low, and if your opponent has something like Oath of Moment, he could just pick that target up very quickly, right? Even indirect fire from units like Desolators over the course of a couple turns can take out a Void Weaver. Also, Void Weavers have to move to get line of sight, and sometimes that means they're going to have to move off objectives. And unless you want to pay the command points, to fire and fade, right back on the objective after it shoots, you're not going to be able to hold that objective. Whereas the Death Jester will always be able to hold it because that's his job. He's just going to sit there on the objective and hold it. On top of this, because he's a lone operative, he's immune to all shooting outside of 12 inches. So he can basically be untargetable, right? Indirect fire can't hurt him, and neither can towering units. So at least, even though your army is not that good at scoring primaries, you will be able to guarantee that you can at least hold the objective in your own deployment zone. I also have a Shadowseer in this list. Now, the Shadowseer joins a simple troop of 5, and basically the Shadowseer has the Phoenix Gem. And again, a lot of you may be thinking, why give the Shadowseer the Phoenix Gem? Why not give it to the Death Jester that's going to be holding objectives? Well, for one, the Death Jester that's holding objectives really doesn't need it, I found out. Because oftentimes, he's not going to be shot at inside of 12 inches anyway. Who really does need it is the Shadowseer. Now, I love using this unit as an Overwatch bait. And a couple of you may be thinking to yourself, well, what do you mean an Overwatch bait? And basically, this is what it is. Whenever I want to threaten an enemy unit, and I know in the first couple of turns in the game, my opponent is going to have Overwatch basically at max capacity, I use this unit, a single troop with a Shadowseer, to proc Overwatch. Basically, I put them into a position where I know my opponent is going to Overwatch them. And inevitably, when my opponent overwatches the unit, as they will, because I'm basically giving it to them on a silver platter, I allocate all the wounds that my opponent shoots at the Shadowseer herself. And typically, if it's a powerful enough Overwatch attack, the Shadowseer will die, but I will save the unit. And because I have the Phoenix Gem on a 2+ at the end of that turn, that Shadowseer is just going to return to the unit anyway, like nothing ever happened. So it basically gives me a way to get around Overwatch in the early turns of the game. And yeah, while it's not the most effective way to deal with Overwatch, it does save the unit quite a few wounds, right? So if I allocate all the wounds to the character itself, the Shadowseer actually has 4 wounds, so it can take quite a bit of punishment. And then typically, enemy units aren't going to deal more than 4 wounds with Overwatch unless it's something really insane, right? So unless you're going up against an Infernus squad or something with a lot of flamers, chances are they'll only kill the Shadowseer max and then kill nothing else. And at that point, your Harlequin troop is free to engage other units in close combat and take them out. Typically units like scouts that are going to be occupying the middle of the board with, scouts or infiltrators and things like that. I also have a Solitaire in my list, of course, because the Solitaire is one of the best melee lone operatives in the entire game. He's really effective at killing characters, but he's also a great control piece and can help you essentially move units from a flank into the enemy's deployment zone. So he can clear out enemy units that might be a threat to them. And also, because he has a 3+ invulnerable save, he is a little bit more durable against basic Overwatch than your normal Harlequin. So he can basically survive an Overwatch on average from a unit of Desolators or something like that, and he can go in there and you can really deal some heavy damage. On top of that, if the Desolators were behind obscuring terrain, which they probably should have been, considering the fact that they're, ignoring line of sight and things like that, and they have indirect fire, then you can easily phantasm away afterwards and continue to use your Solitaire to threaten other enemy units in your opponent's backfield. So Solitaires open up a lot of different options for you as far as being able to control certain areas of the board, and they work as great denial pieces as well. I have a Troop Master in the list with the Weeping Stone, so this Troop Master is actually going to go with a unit of 10 Harlequins. They're going to be on foot, and I usually like to put them in reserve. The reason for this is because I always want to keep my opponent away from the flanks, so that I can have an easier time moving up the sides of the board and controlling those areas. So having a big scare unit in reserve is going to, prevent your opponent from putting their most vulnerable and perhaps deadliest units on the flanks. I also have 2 more Troop Masters. They just go with units of 5. And again, the Troop Masters are just going to give the unit devastating wounds, so they are able to do a little bit more damage and trade a little bit better in close combat. As for my battle line units, I have 1 big Harlequin troop, just basically a massive maximum squad of 12. They're held in reserve with the Troop Master, and their job is just to basically act as a fear factor so my opponent doesn't place a lot of units on the sides of the board that can be assaulted easily, right? And actually, you can assault rather easily out of reserve with a Fate dice. So you'll only need a 3+ to get that charge off if your opponent leaves units close to the flanks. And because of the new reserve rules, you can keep these guys in until basically the last turn. And even though most of the time you're going to want to come in on turn 3 or turn 4 anyway, your opponent is always going to have to worry about them as long as they're in reserve. And once they do come out, they do have the power to sweep through several enemy units in the late game when your shooting has already peppered the enemy down. I also have 2 troops led by the Troop Masters that are in Star Weavers, and these guys basically just deal damage. If there's a unit that reveals itself early on an objective, these guys can easily sweep them off. I also have 2 additional troops that I like to use for trading, one with the Shadowseer that I told you about earlier with the Phoenix Gem kind of little combo that I can do to save them a little bit, and one that's just without anything, and their job is just essentially to trade with units in the early game, things like scouts that are encroaching up on the board and may cause trouble for the rest of my army if left alive. I also have 5 Star Weavers in the army, and I know that may seem like a lot, but the Star Weavers are just so excellent for their cost. They have 2 shuriken cannons, they're only 80 points, and they also allow my units to jump back in them at the end of the assault phase, which can either give them extra movement so they can leapfrog up the board, or give them additional protection so they don't die as easily. And these guys can actually do considerable damage to heavy infantry when crossing no man's land when used in concert with each other. And lastly, you'll probably notice that I only have enough troops to actually fill 4 of these things up. The last one is going to be filled with the Death Jester with the Fate's Messenger enhancement, and also the Solitaire. It gives the Solitaire a little bit of extra threat range that your opponent has to worry about. So when doing their measurements and their screening and stuff, they're going to have to screen out a little bit better because of that 3 extra inches. But also, it gives the Death Jester the ability to get better targets on the first turn of the game. So if you need to get him out 3 inches and then move 8 inches to get line of sight on something, it can very much help with that. as you do want to be shooting with that Death Jester as many times as possible throughout the course of the game. As for the other data sheets, I have 3 units of 2 Skyweavers. 2 of the units have the Star Bolas and Skyweaver Haywire Cannon, so I know what you might be thinking, well, why not the Zephyr Glaives on everything? The thing about the Zephyr Glaives is that my army already has so much combat presence with all the troops that I need a little bit of extra shooting, so I chose to go with the Star Bolas in this case. I do have 1 unit of Zephyr Glaives, however, because I do want the option of getting into close combat with these guys. And typically, I use the unit with the Zephyr Glaives to bait out units in the center of the board, while the units with the Star Bolas are going to be on the flanks, trying to pick off enemy vehicles, getting line of sight on them, but also ready to jump in against heavy infantry with their Star Bolas as well. And lastly, I have 3 Void Weavers. Now, I have 2 Void Weavers with the prismatic cannons. I actually think that in a Harlequin list, this is the best way to run them, is with the prismatic cannons, because they're actually good against monsters. They're strength 12, AP -3, and damage 4. So they do significant damage against bigger targets like that. The Haywire Cannon is something that I kind of regret taking, and that's because I already have so much Haywire in this list with the Skyweavers that I probably didn't need the extra Haywire Cannon. So it's also less cost efficient than the Skyweavers with Haywire Cannons, so that was also a little bit of a mistake on my part. However, I think both builds are good in certain ways, but I just think that in this particular Harlequins list, I already had enough anti-vehicle, and I probably could do with another prismatic cannon, especially with the way I was running them, using these guys as a long-range artillery piece. However, altogether, these things did provide a lot of value over the course of the game, and they're very cost efficient. And I have to say, the prismatic cannons surprised me. They have a lot of value for the cost, and because these guys also come with 2 shuriken cannons, if they do need to get a little bit closer and just unleash on enemy infantry, they can do so very effectively. Alright, so now that we've gone over the list, let's go ahead and talk about my final thoughts on it and if there's room for improvement. So I think there were a couple things I felt could be swapped out that didn't produce a whole lot of value in this particular list, one of which was the Void Weaver with the Haywire Cannon, and the other was the Shadow Seer. And again, with the Shadow Seer, I probably could have swapped that out for something else. Even another Death Jester I think would have gotten more value for me, but also just another Skyweaver that I could have put something in. And I think both of those would have more value than the Shadow Seer did. Even though I think the idea of the Shadow Seer and the way I used it was probably the best way to use a Shadow Seer, I don't think it was really all that effective. The Void Weaver with the Haywire Cannon, again, was decent, but because the Haywire Cannon has a really short range, it often found itself in vulnerable positions that my other Void Weavers didn't have to deal with. So I do think that that one was a little bit out of place in this particular list, considering that I already had a lot of Haywire in it. The list also had a really hard time against Knight armies that with the towering keyword and shooting could just blast away my Haywire Cannons off the board if they got first turn, which they did. I went up against a Chaos Knight army, and that's exactly what happened. My Haywire weapons were blown off the board pretty much turn 1, and the rest of my army really struggled to kill the rest of his army. I was, however, able to pick up wins against Death Guard and Imperial Guard by picking my fights well and baiting Overwatch early. But on the other hand, I lost the game to Space Marines on primary objectives. So I did go against a Space Marine army, and they beat me on primary objectives pretty considerably. I also would probably have trouble against Tyranids and or Chaos Demons who do not have vehicles but have tough monsters instead, especially against Be'lakor. And I was just thinking to myself, how would I deal with a Be'lakor army at this list? And I really don't have a good answer for it. I could throw the Solitaire in there, but Be'lakor would probably beat the Solitaire. The Solitaire's good, but he can't solo Be'lakor, right? And with the Shroud the Be'lakor has, I can't really target him with a lot of ranged weapons in my army. And when melee is the only option, unfortunately, Harlequin troops just don't hit hard enough on their own to be able to deal with the big monsters that Chaos Demons can field. And the same is very true of Tyranids, which have a lot of high toughness monsters that would be tough to deal with. Also, something I didn't play against, but would be absolutely a nightmare for Harlequins to fight against, are Custodes. And the reason I say this is because Custodes have 2 abilities that really mess up Harlequins pretty bad. One, everything in their army gets a 4+ Feel No Pain against mortal wounds. So their vehicles are getting a 4+ Feel No Pain against Haywire. which makes them a lot tougher against the haywire cannons that you have in your army. Also, they fight first when on objectives, so when they're controlling an objective and you want to charge a Harlequin unit in there, you better think twice, because oftentimes your Harlequin unit will die before they make a single attack. Custodes hit on 2s in close combat most of the time and have extremely deadly weapons. Yes, you get a 4+ invul save, but each custode has a good amount of attacks, so you're probably going to just be picking your models right off the table and right back into their carrying case. So yeah, I think Harlequins have a really tough time against Custodes, unfortunately, because they have the fights first, because they have the feel no pain 4+ against mortals. It's going to be an uphill battle every single time. And Custodes, obviously are one of the toughest armies in the game to deal with right now. They're above 50% win rate, and they're a very strong faction overall. And the biggest advice I would give you for having to deal with Custodes is just don't engage them in close combat, shoot their infantry off the objectives, and just try to do as much damage to their vehicles as possible. But again, you're mostly going to want to focus on shooting them down, whittling them down over the course of the game, and then really going full-fledged in the late game and trying to basically break them. Which may still be kind of difficult to do because they do have a great armor save and they are very tough as well. So, use your shooting to the best of its capabilities. The prismatic cannons are very good at dealing with their high toughness infantry. And of course, at the very least, your shuriken cannons should be able to deal with their lighter units. Okay, so in conclusion, I think Harlequins are a very fun army to play and still have some really even matchups despite their nerfs against most armies in the game. They also bring a lot of hard-hitting anti-vehicle and infantry to the table and have the speed to apply it exactly where it needs to be. However, the army really does suffer against the stronger factions in 40k with a particularly bad matchup versus knights if you don't get the first turn. And again, if you don't get the first turn against knights, all those really effective haywire weapons that are, going to take down those big knights are going to be dead. So you're basically going to have no tools to deal with them. So you do have to be very careful in that matchup because if, you don't put your units in reserve or protect them somehow, it's really going to be a very uphill battle for you. And yeah, I know that Harlequins aren't as good as they were last edition. Everybody can agree on that, but I think they are still fun, and I think there is still a reason to play Harlequins in 10th. I do like how they feel still. They are different from Craft-Rolled Eldar in a number of ways. Are they as good as the Craft-Rolled Eldar? No, because they just don't have the tools that the Craft-Rolled Eldar currently do. But that doesn't mean they're not still effective, right? They're just not as good by comparison. However, balance changes are coming up in September and things may change. We don't know. So we'll have to just wait and see what they do with that. I probably don't think that Harlequins will get any kind of changes whatsoever, but I guarantee you there are going to be nerfs against the top units in our faction in general. So things like Wraith Knights and of course Fire Prisms may unfortunately be on the chopping block. We'll just have to wait and see, but those are my predictions at least, and when those nerfs do happen, Harlequin units could be looking a lot better by comparison, especially the Void Weaver, which right now is the main competitor point for point with the Fire Prism. But we'll just kind of have to wait and see on that. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last month. Your help has been greatly appreciated. If you do want to join the Patreon and support the channel, I have free trials activated so you don't have to pay a dime. And that also gives you permanent access to our Discord community, which is made up of a great group of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about Eldar strategies, tactics, and of course, hobbying. Lastly, I do have a channel store page with a lot of Eldar-inspired apparel. If you do want to rep your favorite faction at your local game store, I will also leave the link for that in the description as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out. I'll see you guys next time and have some great games over this weekend. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.